Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm, and we're pleased to have you join us for this Crisis Coach webinar. Today, we're going to be discussing your intelligence network. Take a good look at yourself. This is the 9th in the series of the Crisis Coach discussions that we're having jointly with our good friends at the Rochester Business Alliance. And our presenter today is going to be Jim Satterfield. He's the president of Firestorm. We'd like to also invite you to become our friend. Facebook, we're known as Firestorm Solutions, and you can follow us on Twitter at Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We remind you the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. And the work product that we provide must be read and considered in conjunction with your organization's personal counsel. In addition, do not interpret this information as legal advice or legal opinion. We're delighted that the Rochester Business Alliance is our partner and co-host on this series of webinars. This is the 9th in the series. We invite you to go to firestorm.com. You can register for future webinars, and you can watch recorded versions of past webinars in this series. Our moderator today is our very good friend, Chip Dawson at the Rochester Business Alliance. Chip, over to you, please.
Well, thank you, Bill. It's nice to join you on this beautiful morning in Rochester. And good morning to everyone participating today. Strange as it may seem with the high summer temperatures and the dry days of the past couple of weeks, fall is just 13 days away. And while crises large and small will continue unabated, most of us will have the pleasure of enjoying what is typically a delightful season in Rochester. And this morning, we have the pleasure of expanding our knowledge of the Crisis Coach process with the 9th in the 2015 series of the Crisis Coach. The Business Alliance is pleased to continue our partnership with Firestorm and our friends at the Eastern Great Lakes Association of Contingency Planners to bring you, our members, this important 45-minute discussion by Jim Satterfield, one of the country's top crisis managers. Today, Jim will cover Take a Good Look at Yourself, a complementary addition to the intelligence network discussion of the past 2 months. You know, I hate surprises. Maybe it's because I'm one of those people, there was a surprise, one of those people who wants to be in control of the situation. For me, a surprise means something is happening that I'm not prepared for. I've had many over the years, and they've had the effect of making me a better safety person, as well as a better husband, father, homeowner, friend. You get the picture. Well, a good friend of mine was for many years the head of the state of Alabama Safety Consultation Program. An industrial hygienist by training, he was what we'd call a very savvy individual. He tells the story of a surprise he got once. He was doing an inspection of a decommissioned World War II Army Air Corps field and had climbed a long ladder up to the operating floor of the old wooden control tower. He pushed the trapdoor hatch open and stuck his head in and came face to face with well over 100 rattlesnakes covering the floor. Fortunately, not only was he savvy, but he was cool, and he knew how to respond properly to his instant threat assessment. It's a good bet that none of you will face a similar threat here at work in Rochester, but as Jim will tell us this morning, you had better have a very good idea of the threats you might face and be prepared to put the 5-step activation matrix into play. And now here's Jim.
Chip, I always am impressed by everything you say. And the insights that you add to our conversations each month are extremely valuable. I did some research on surprise, and I join you in that same statement. And I normally say that the last time a surprise was good, I was 5, and it was my birthday. I have found that there is a city in Arizona with over 100,000 people in it named Surprise. So now I have something else to say sometimes it's good to wake up in surprise in that area. As you were telling the rattlesnake story, I was reminded of all the Indiana Jones movies where he looks down and goes, "It had to be snakes." And the snakes are different in all of our businesses and in all of the areas that we're faced with, but knowing that they could be there and what to do makes a big difference. I would imagine that was probably the fastest that he ever got out of that area in that period of time. So thanks, Chip, for thinking about the topics and sharing those insights. I'm always impressed and will remain so. Chip mentioned that also sponsoring today is the ACP chapter in the Eastern Great Lakes area, and you see their information up on the screen now. And if you are not a member of that, that's a good opportunity for you to find peers that are in the same type of business that you are in dealing with disasters and crises. So today we want to try to focus our thoughts a little bit around this slide, and we're going to fill in some of the details. We've shared this before. Now, we all know stuff, and we've certainly been working on our plans and the details, and in some areas we know what it is that we don't know, and so we make programs in place to get that information for us and to understand. But the big liability that sits there is what you don't know, you don't know. And as you think about that, in the business of business continuity or crisis management or responding in any of these types of areas, the big exposure comes from that massive piece that we just don't know about, and we don't think about it, and we have to discover it, and we're discovering it when time matters most. And in general rule in all of these areas is that it's about time and access. So today we're going to focus in filling in that orange portion and some of the tools you already know about, but at least to reinforce those as we go forward. So the process that you would do is pretty much up on the screen of how we would go about filling that. Now, through the Rochester Business Alliance and the Eastern Great Lakes Contingency Association, if you want an assessment of where your plans are relative to standards and best practices, Firestorm will do that and waive the fee for you. So that might be a good beginning point to start to understand it. Or you could conduct your own benchmark gap analysis and take the standards and see where you are relative to them and do a much more formal analysis. You could do the risk and vulnerability threat assessment or the BIA, the business impact analysis, showing you what the impacts are, who your internal and external dependencies are, and have a much better understanding of what goes on. Once that's done, you will look at your strategies to make sure you have strategies to address those areas, develop plans then that become actionable. And one of the big differences that we find in plans is they tell you what but not how. And so that's a quick gap that you can start to fill, because trying to figure out how to do something in the middle of a crisis certainly isn't beneficial. Then what are you going to say? Your crisis communications plans, your message maps, training and making sure that everyone understands, and that awareness we're going to come back to in a couple of minutes to fill those gaps associated with it. And then exercise and testing of the plans, and then finally maintaining and updating them. If you don't keep your plans current, they won't have a good resolution associated with it. So as we think about it, and we've spent the last month, 2 months talking about an intelligence network, the goal that we all have here is knowing about what's going on before now, being able to carry this forward to respond before the incident, to plan before the area is coming up to be something that we must address. So we've asked you this question: can you identify your organization's next crisis? And the answer is you must be able to do that. That's the reason why you've been attending these webinars, or you go to the meetings and the conferences, why you have a job in this particular space, is that you have to be able to identify what those next crises will be, so that you can help manage your organization through those escalations as they come together. Now, we'll talk more about the Predict, Plan, Perform several times this morning before we wrap this up, but that at least gives you a framework to make sure that you have those elements in place. And when we think about Predict, Plan, Perform, it's predicting what the vulnerabilities and threats are, understanding what those impacts are, establishing how you monitor to see that those are about to occur, and having specific triggers that cause your plans to go into action. The plan doesn't really matter. Is it a communicable illness plan? Is it a workplace violence? Is it a business continuity plan? All of those areas are there for us to have the detail in place. And then finally, under perform, have you trained your plan, your people? Have you tested it? Do you have the supplies that you need to have? Are you monitoring those activities that you identified back in the predict phase of this planning process? And then finally, do you have a structure in place to make decisions in a crisis? That gives us a framework by which we start to carry forward. So understanding that, it brings us to what's next. Although we've got an external monitoring plan, that's a start. It's not the end, and it's not the full answer. And one of the differentiators that we're starting to see is that organizations are looking for intelligence networks. They are looking to make sure that senior management is not put in a position to be surprised. But if you're going to build that network, everybody needs to understand what the threats and risks are. And I responded yesterday to a request that came out of Atlanta to a contingency group there. They had a location where they'd had a workplace violence program, a workplace violence event at their location in Virginia. And management was saying, well, isn't there some way that we can monitor and see those things? And so I responded back to them about the behaviors of concern that we've talked about and how you can monitor that behavior via social media. But it's got to be clearly understood. It's also got to be discussed. You can't start to explain all this in the middle of the crisis when the lightning strike hits the building. And if you remember, last month we did a virtual exercise. We had some 318 companies participate in a live crisis event to see the decision process that was going on. In fact, we'll be scheduling another one of those, and I would encourage you for that event to have your emergency team around the table to go through and experience making decisions in a crisis. Things have to be documented and categorized. Those categorizing, it says, what are we doing in each one of the phases, in each one of the stages of these of this event? What are the specific activities associated with this kind of a threat or that? Obviously, a physical threat versus a cyber threat require different activities in terms of response as we carry forward. So what are these activities? They're common as you think about your business. It could be with your building or a campus if you have multiple buildings associated with that. It could affect your customers, your employees, vendors, visitors on site, contractors that could be there. How is it going to be established? We're going to talk about awareness in a few minutes and what you need to be aware of so that you can see this coming forward. As we've talked about the monitoring and the triggers. What are the communications escalation points and the types of communications? In every crisis, there's three kinds of communications. There's the 3 C's of crisis communications. First is coordination. What is it that you want people to do? Second, compliance. Who is it that you have to notify associated with this? And last, the crisis, the brand and reputation management, those levels of communication. What are your intervention procedures? How do you notify people? Do you have a notification system in place? Is it available and working? And then what's the decision process that you must go through? If you want to start to organize your thoughts, these are the 5 common failures that we see repeated from one disaster to another on a regular basis. These common themes are always there. The first is failure to control critical supply chains. If you manufacture something or you have a business that you work, there are certain vendors that are critical to you, and if you don't have them delivering the products or services that you require, you can't meet your job objective. Your company will not function well. Today, most companies only own 10 or 15% of their supply chain. That means you have a 90% dependency on a third party. So have you identified your critical vendors? Have you looked at their business continuity plans or communicable illness plans? That's a specific exposure that you need to have in place and to begin to address. Second, have you trained your employees for working at home? We found that 70% of employees across all the companies in America don't have a clue about what to do in a disaster or a crisis. Well, that's not going to give you an optimum performance at that critical level, and 95% of them don't have a disaster plan at home. Having a plan at home is a fundamental building block of a plan at work, because if there's an area-wide disaster, a storm that's coming in that's affecting families, people will focus on their family and forget about what they need to do their job. Family trumps job every day. So if you want to make sure your employees are prepared and available, make sure they have a plan at home. To help with that, you can go to the Firestorm website and download for free the ebook, Disaster Ready People for Disaster Ready America, or you can get print copies to hand out for your employees, and you can even insert in a print version a copy of what your plan is. We've done this with multiple companies around the country, and it's a great way to build that awareness and base. The third is the failure to identify and monitor all threats and risks. We started our discussion today talking about doing that, and I'll give you some tools to work in that direction in just a few minutes. But if you haven't identified those threats and you don't monitor for them, then you'll find that they're upon you and you're being forced to react. Fourth is the failure to conduct exercises and test your plans and updating your plan. Turnover is a fact of life. When you look there and you go to activate your plan, if those people are no longer in charge or there, you've got a gap. If you haven't tested your plan, you won't find out that there's a fatal flaw associated with it. Short of fire drills, there are very few companies that are testing on a regular basis. The absolute minimum is you should test your plan annually, but we would recommend that you test components of your plan on a quarterly basis. That's becoming the best practices in the market. And last, failure to develop a crisis communications plan. What are your key messages for each one of the vulnerabilities and threats that you identified earlier to each stakeholder group? What you tell your employees may be different than what you tell the public. What you're telling your bank on the line of credit and your investors, or sharing those elements, will vary greatly. So you would solve these 5 areas. This is the place to start. If you identify those, we're starting to close some of the gaps in your current planning. So you'd follow the predict, plan, perform process. You'd identify and involve the groups that you see on the screen. You conduct the exercises, and then you establish how you would monitor and communicate during those events. So if we're going to start there, we now need a framework to look at how our plans come together. And we've shared this chart with you before, but to go through it, we see 5 stages of planning that needs to be in place. Pre-action is all the stuff you're doing now. You're attending this webinar to hear us talk about the types of things that you need to have in place. This is the writing of your plans, the establishing of your intelligence network, the training, the test exercises. All of those come together. When you have the event, our focus is immediately on life and safety and health. As the event starts to escalate, you're going to activate your emergency response plan or your incident management plan associated with it. Once we have taken those initial actions, then we can shift over to do an impact assessment. You would do one early assessment, which is a high level. How bad is it? And then as you look at it in more detail, are we going to be out of our building? Are our people impacted? Is our building or is our equipment? What's happening to us as an organization associated? If it's severe enough, you'll declare a crisis and activate your crisis management plan. Now, when we think about the emergency response, that's very tactical. The crisis management plan is very strategic. What's going to happen to our brand and reputation, our ability to operate and function as a company? And then we'd activate our business continuity plans in each department. There's a business continuity program over all of the organization, but then a recovery plan, a response and recovery plan in each department. Once we're back up and working, then we can focus on what are the lessons learned here. That's in that post-recovery period where we would do the hot wash and identify the lessons learned and come back and update. And that loop we showed you on an earlier slide would certainly come into play. So if you think about it, the action matrix that we associated with it, here are more details that would fit in. Identifying the threats, establishing the intelligence network, Who's going to respond if that, in fact, has been said? How we coordinate that between the various portions within our company, and identify primary and alternative assignments. There's a rule that we call HR Rule 1, 2, 3. You need to be 3 deep at each critical position within your organization. Someone could be off that day. They could be hurt in the event. So who's going to step into place and carry that forward? I would also encourage you that as you're designing these exercises, I would run an exercise with all your alternates in place. It'll have a completely different feel in the exercise in trying to understand what are we going to do and how are we going to carry that forward. Then you've got to document everything, document the responses, the messaging, and all of the activation levels as we look through our plans. Now, I told you that I would share some tools with you, and I'll show you 2 on the next slide. And the first is looking at what the impacts are and how do we know. So if you look at this, this is designing a hazard impact matrix. And you would have what is the kind of an event in the left column, the probability or likelihood that it would occur, the onset speed, the forewarning that we would have. Like in a hurricane, we generally have a lot of warning. In a tornado, not so much. In a workplace violence event, unless we're monitoring for behaviors concerned, we'd have virtually none. The duration, the intensity, and then looking at human impact, property impact, business impact, coming up with a total score, and then multiplying together to get a risk rating overall. Now, as we think about all the risk and exposures that we have in our location, we think about the natural things that could happen, a winter storm, the tornado, a flood, the biological events, the communicable illness that could happen, the hazardous spill that could be associated with it, the technology areas. We're seeing cyber breach dominating the news and dominating the boardrooms. And in fact, we're engaged with several companies at their boards, and particularly the the audit committee of the board is directing to make sure that the company can, in fact, respond to that cyber breach at this level. And then finally, the human-induced. That could be an accident. It could be a violence episode. So as you start to break all of those down and weighting them, if we're saying even if the rating isn't high, you need to have a plan. But clearly for those that rate high in that analysis, you're betting the company on that particular area. And those would certainly be on the high likelihoods, the high risk scores. Those are the ones that you need to put into your test plan so that you're testing for those on a regular basis. So now once we've identified all of the hazards and have those analyzed, we need to say, well, when do we activate our plan? How do we know? Then you would start to list the categories, and as you see in the sample down below, you could put those impacts into a couple of different areas. And in this company, they looked at critical suppliers and environmental and operations, et cetera. And then they decided a category 1, which would be normal kinds of business decisions. A category 2 is an increase of that from an incident into some type of a moderate level. And then finally, a category 3 is a full-blown crisis, and so senior management would be notified. And you see descriptors in each one of those blocks. That type of an activation matrix is customized for every company around what their profile looks like. And that's a tool that becomes very easy, because then you can make sure that everyone within your organization, if they see this, they now know who's in charge and which team must be responding and how those actions would be carried out. That's a key critical way that on a single piece of paper, everyone would understand. Because depending upon the level of the crisis, you're going to have a different response function. As you see here, this chart shows it flowing in a company, so that if it's a low-level event, the on-site emergency people might handle it. If it's in that middle moderate level that could give rise, your incident response team could be kicking in. And then finally, if it's that crisis level, that category 3, the level 3 that's associated with it, then the crisis management team is involved. They'd be informing your board, and there'd be a coordination function around all of those elements. Every company structure is slightly different. Your terms may be different in here, but to be able to graphically let people know who's got the ball makes a real difference. So if we think about where we are from a risk standpoint, we've thought traditionally up to this point. Now, we've shared some things with you in the past around where we see business continuity and resilience going, and it's shifting, and it's moving in a different direction to look around business crisis risk. And we'll talk about the structural, operational, and functional areas in just a moment to remind you again, but this is an opportunity to grow the business continuity professional from just dealing with those types of immediate threats to dealing with threats that have a more strategic impact on the company, those things that can affect the people, the profitability, the brand, or reputation. The goal in all of these areas is to know before they actually occur, before the crisis actually escalates at that point. And it comes back to that theme that we talked about as we opened this morning, to know before now. So if we look at the risks that are embedded within our organization, structurally, there's something that's happening within our organization. It's how we're structured, the management, the communications of information, the behaviors of senior management. Those are certainly an element as we think about business crisis risk. The operational aspects refers to how the company handles the basic business processes. Are we centralized? Are we decentralized? How does this information flow? And then finally, functional, are there silos within an organization? I've never worked for a company or been involved with any company that Firestorm has dealt with over the last decade that we don't find information silos, that only portions of the facts are known to only portions of the people, resulting in suboptimal performance. We're about to get the football season off to a big start. The first college games have already occurred. The pro games will be starting here quickly. There has to be communications, because if people don't recognize what's happening on that play, the team won't perform well. Well, exactly the same thing will happen within your company. So why is all of this important? Well, most crises can be foreseen. It's just not at that instant. But if we can identify that that potential is there, and we start to see the indicators, the warning signs that are there, then it gives us a chance to move forward and to respond better. If management chooses not to prepare, now then we're in a situation where that's where you see, after many of the events, that management has been terminated, and there is a problem associated in those areas. So identifying the risk and monitoring them empowers management to avoid or mitigate the impacts that could come on our business from a financial perspective, from a human perspective, from an operational perspective. So as we think about crisis, let's think about the complexity. Many of the things that we deal with are very targeted crises. They're easily identifiable. We get the storm bulletin today that there's going to be severe weather. We know what it is. We have an idea of when it's going to occur. It's a fairly straightforward opportunity. But a complex crisis could have multiple events. It would be very difficult to measure the full impact of a cyber breach on a company. You know, what data was taken? How did it impact our customers and our employees? Are we dealing with PII? Are we dealing with PHI? There's more pressure here because there's interrelationships between who caused the problem and where it would come together. So as you think about a crisis, those things that business continuity has traditionally focused on have been very targeted. The way that business is growing in the direction that we're moving is they're becoming much more complex today. So now when we think about a crisis, let's also think about the time to react. Now, if it's reactive and urgent, you're focused on the event. The whole organization is not consumed by this. If we knew that we were having a violence episode on the production floor, it's not going to affect the people up in accounting. So you've got to look at those areas where we're reacting to it. It's urgent, but it's not all-consuming for the organization. Comparing that to an extreme urgency where everybody is involved. When Hurricane Sandy came up the coast and started to impact all the businesses there and the organization that was put into place, it became everything associated with those companies. What's the impact on their supply chains, on their customers, in coming into those directions? So there's an extreme urgency for action. If you take these elements and put them together, you look at the diagnostic model that we've shared with you before around business crisis risk. And you can see the targeted extreme urgency. Those are the tornadoes, the winter storms, the violence episodes that we traditionally think about in the business continuity areas. But if you look down below that, it could be targeted and urgent and reactive and becoming a difficult business problem. There's some failure here. We don't have processes and controls in place. And if it's left to become chronic, then it's systemic within the organization. Could be an escalation on multiple fronts within the organization, and it's much more complex to solve that. And then finally, it escalates into becoming that severe business crisis. It's something that could throw outside intervention from regulators and lenders, and even a death cycle that the company couldn't come out of it and make those changes as they need to survive. So where we've seen business continuity to this point is focused into that blue square. If you look at the green and the orange and the red, that's the direction that we're moving. And so establishing how does your business continuity program work in those areas, and how does that same structure apply across it becomes the challenge that you're faced with. An example of those types of risk, again, could well be the ones that we see around cyber breach and cyber risk, because what we're seeing companies do is moving that direction and not involving many of the infrastructures that you've placed with your business continuity plans as you've gone within the company. So as we think about it, our goal today was take a look in the mirror to try to figure out where we are with the intelligence networks and what we need to have. And I think today we need to be focused on a much more dynamic risk process. And the elements here you see in the little equation, they're tactical actions. They're audits that can take place. There's internal audit. We're seeing increasingly that internal audit is playing an expanded role within corporations from a continuity and crisis perspective, where we feel like we're ready within a company. Internal audit is asking, how do you know and are you sure, and the role that they play there. We've got to train our management and board on what are the indicators that are out there. What should we be looking at so that we can know what's going on, and then the physical security elements that are in place. The social media intelligence, we talked about that heavily in July and August with the webinar series, and if you missed those, you can certainly go back and view them off the Firestorm website. But having that intelligence network, the statistics here are overwhelming. If someone has ill intent, 80% of the time, somebody else knows. 67% of the time, 2 or more people know, and when they know, they talk. And where do people talk today? They talk on social media. So when you want to know, by the way, we're finding out it's not only violence indicators that we're picking up, we're picking up quality problems. When people are talking about product recall issues or difficulty within a company, operational issues are being discussed on social media. So you can play a role in providing that insight into management as a key indicator. We've also seen the ISO standards change for quality, where now risk is included in them. This is your opportunity to watch your job grow into these other areas as we bring those elements in place. And then the action indicators. What's the indicator that you'd look for to know that this problem was occurring? Remember earlier we talked about listing all the hazards in all of the areas that we could potentially have. What are the indicators? What's a derivative measurement for that? If you start to see school closings or closing of businesses in your town, that might well be an indication that there's a communicable illness there. We responded this summer to a measles outbreak. We saw recently a North Carolina school having to close because of an intestinal infection that went through the entire school. So there can be derivative indicators that could tell you that what you've been planning for is in the process of occurring. Identifying those and looking at them. And then finally, communications. Those 3 C's of communications, those 3 categories can be critical, because for every threat, you then need to say, who are we going to communicate? What are we going to do? Who are we going to communicate to? What are we going to communicate, and how are we going to do that? That becomes a critical element for us as we go and carry that forward. And again, those 3 C's are coordination, compliance, and crisis. Our messages vary depending upon what we're sending at that point. So the predict, plan, perform methodology helps. Understanding those vulnerabilities and threats, planning, putting policies and procedures, and then performing, training, and testing, and monitoring to be able to carry that forward. So let's summarize a little bit where we are. So if this happens, if you have warning, when do you want to know? And the answer is, do you want to know before now? If you told me yesterday that we were going to have this problem, we could have put some things in place. If you're telling me now that it could happen in an hour, at least it gives me an hour to prepare. This is the key element that we're associated with. It's about time and access. So our next steps are, we want to start looking at what the consequences are. What are the metrics? How will we measure those? And understanding those within our plans and our responsibilities. There's a shift between strategical and tactical. Up to this point, business continuity in many cases is viewed within organizations as tactical, not strategic. It's been a, yeah, we got a business continuity plan, check a box. But now if we start to look at these other business crisis risks, if we look at where the company is going, we're moving into a much more strategic role in helping in those areas. So the business crisis risk, looking at those other three quadrants, gives you a structure to take the infrastructure that you put in place from a planning perspective and making it integral with every portion within the company. Having an intelligence network, we've spent an awful lot of time this year talking about that because we saw that as a significant gap. And if you remember on those 5 common failures, the third is the failure to identify and monitor all threats and risks. Monitor, that means an intelligence network. What's the indicator that that risk is about to happen? What's the trigger point? How bad does it have to get before you carry forward with a plan implementation? Just got a report of a SARS outbreak and saw that that's coming back in a particular area. Well, do you have business in that region? Are you having a supplier or a vendor? Do you have a key client there? How does that impact you and your organization? Instant access tools, and it's a little different to think about IT in terms of instant access. When you think about it from that perspective, today's plans are not a binder on a shelf. We've heard that for years in the business continuity profession. We still have binders, and it's good to have hard copy of these things, but there are various systems out that you can have plans on your computers. But in the middle of an evacuation, no one's going to be carrying their desktop out the door with them. The key today is to have the plan on the smartphone, on the device that's in the employee's hands. No, everyone is less than 3 feet away from their phone, and today you can have the key checklist in the hands of every employee. Maybe every employee has the emergency plan. Maybe the accounting department has access to their business continuity plan while the engineering department has access to their business continuity plan. And senior management has their crisis management plan and ultimately access to everything else, all on their smartphone. Now, if the internet's down, the smartphone still has the plan because it's been downloaded to it. If the electricity is out, the smartphone has a battery. So you would have access to those plans and those communications. And if the internet is up, then you have it as another communications tool built in and integrated. So in today's world, if you don't have instant access in the hands of your employees, your plan does not align to standards and best practices. The world has changed. Before we started the call today, Chip was sharing that he's just gotten a new iPhone, and he and his wife are now up to date with the latest technology, and that old flip phone has been retired. Today, everybody has that device in their hands. We're gone are the days of the old roll paper faxes that were out there to get information. The expectation is that you can have that plan in the palm, the right plan in the palm of each employee at the instant they need it. So what can you do? You can participate in an exercise with your team. If you'd like our help, we certainly would be glad to do that. We'll let you know the next time we schedule a virtual exercise. At a minimum, that's a great way to start to see how your team reacts. We'll be working with a client next week on a cyber breach exercise? How does that impact their company? How will they recognize it? What actions will they take? How does that integrate with the rest of the organization? You want to make sure your plan's aligned to standards and best practices. We've given you many insights in this webinar series this year to be talking about what best practices are. Your plans were great a year ago or 3 years ago or 5 years ago, but if they're not aligned today, then you've got a gap. Then you've got to have your own intelligence network, and that information has to flow to you. This is your opportunity to have a seat at the table to provide that information to senior management, and then make sure that all your people are trained. There are a lot of challenges ahead, and knowing the warning, taking a look at those elements becomes extremely important to make sure that we have addressed all of those areas. So if this happens, do you have the warning? Are you ready now? Are you ready before these events happen? When we talk about taking a good look at yourself, those were the questions that we wanted to put into your mind. So Chip, we're starting to wind down, and I know you've got an important meeting that you're going to at 10:30. Any insights that you want to share as a result of our discussion?
Sure, Bill. Thanks for, or Jim rather. Thanks for asking. As always, you've covered a lot of great stuff, a lot of tools, and huge amount of stuff that people can do. It occurs to me, though, that getting started is often difficult for companies. How do you take the first step? What gets the rest of the company interested? And one thought that I have is read the morning paper. You know, it's so easy to pick up the paper and skim through it very quickly and say, could this happen to me? And an example, this morning's paper has the data breach for Excelis Blue Cross Blue Shield with the potential loss of about data on about 10 million clients, which is one of the largest losses for the Rochester area for sure. But to sit down every morning in a little morning meeting and say to everybody, okay, you read the paper, how could any of this affect us, would be something that would get them kick-started. And once they start talking about that and get into it, then they can look at the website, they can contact you, they can get more help, they can do all the work that they need to do, but that gets their attention. And I think that's what's critical for us.
Great insights, Chip. And one of the things that we want to emphasize here is that these are business problems. These are business issues. They're not a security issue. They're not an IT issue. They're not a business continuity. They're business issues. And if you want to make a difference in your company, providing that insight, providing that intelligence, there are indicators of cyber breach well to know in advance. Monitoring those, seeing what's out there to know in advance. 10 million people impacted by a loss of PHI and ultimately PII information. By the way, you probably all are aware that PHI is more valuable on the dark web than PII information. And so the value of 10 million people information being potentially stolen or lost, we're talking in terms of billions of dollars of liability associated with that. The multipliers here are staggering that could be associated with it. And it's enough that could financially ruin an organization. But even if it's able to survive, will people continue to trust that organization as it goes together? We've seen a series of problems happening, whether it's those or the other events that are out there. The exposures and risk are real. Our response and our planning will make the difference. So our thanks again to the Rochester Business Alliance and to the Association of Contingency Planners, the Eastern Great Lakes chapter, underwriting this webinar series. If you'd like to view this or other webinars, you can go to firestorm.com. They're recorded there, or you can send us an email at webinars@Firestorm if you have a particular question, or pick up the phone and give us a call at 800-321-2219. Happy fall to everyone. As Chip pointed out earlier, it's just a couple of weeks away. let's find opportunities that we can continue to work together. Until next month, have a great day and a great fall. And this is Jim Satterfield at Firestorm. Goodbye.
Thanks, Jim. Bye, everyone.